Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, The Future of Copay Accumulators and Maximizers, Understanding New Rules and Emerging Trends to Devise an Effective Mitigation Strategy in 2021. This webinar is sponsored by TrialCard. TrialCard provides patient affordability, medication access and adherence, patient support, and clinical trial services on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Founded in 2000, TrialCard has connected nearly 33 million patients with over $15 billion in branded drug savings to date, and the company is headquartered in Morrisville, North Carolina. I'm Sean Edwards, Director of Marketing Ops. I'll be introducing today's webinar. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. First, you should be able to see a title slide on your screen. If you're having any problems viewing the webinar or encounter any technical difficulties, please use your chat box. Send a question directly to me, the host, and I will try to help you. Second, I'd like to explain how we're handling questions. Now, due to the number of attendees, participant lines are muted. However, if you'd like to submit a question for our presenter, please do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your question to all panelists. We'll answer all questions that we have time to address during the session. Please do feel free to contact our presenter with any additional questions. Please note the webinar will also be recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so you can view it again. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Jason Zemcik. Jason is a product director for TrialCard's TC Synapse suite of compliance and risk management solutions, which encompasses copay program fraud monitoring and detection, copay accumulator mitigation strategies, and government exclusion and anti-kickback safeguards. And now, without further ado, here is Senior Director, Product Manager, Jason Zemcik.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sean, and thank you to the team at World Congress for organizing this event. You are always outstanding to work with. This time has been no exception, so we certainly appreciate this opportunity to talk about a very relevant and timely issue for so many in the pharmaceutical industry. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us today. As I said, this obviously has significant impact for a number of us. So our hope today is that we can provide quite a bit of information and educational content and help you make sense of this issue, kind of some of the unique complexities that are around it, devise a strategy for how you plan to tackle it for your organization. So without further ado, we will get right into the presentation. Now, I have a quick agenda here that just kind of outlines what we plan to talk about today. We are going to do a quick review just on accumulators and maximizers and how they work. We want to keep most of the content forward-looking and talk about trends and market developments and where we see the issue heading. But just to kind of set the stage, we will do just some quick recap on the topic. As I mentioned, talk about trends, what we've noticed in the market this year to date, and then also very timely issue, the 2021 Notice of Benefit Payment Parameters that was recently released, kind of dissect that a little bit and understand exactly what it says and how it would apply to copay programs. We'll also talk specifically about variable copay benefit design. That's an area that often gets included in this conversation. It's becoming more and more significant. So we'll spend some time looking at those. And then, as I mentioned, look at what we see on the horizon in this area as we head into 2021 to get to this time of year and begin making plans for next year's programs. Hopefully offer some insightful recommendations as you look forward to next year. And finally, wrap it all up with some best practices based on what we've seen in dealing with this topic and kind of some ways to help better understand it and guide the formation of strategies around it. And then, of course, leave some time for questions and answers. So again, hopefully it'll be a very informative and beneficial hour for everyone, and looking forward to engaging and sharing some information. So as I said, a brief review, accumulators and maximizers 101. So copay accumulators, or as the actual specific term is copay accumulator adjustments, because the actual practice is where a health plan is adjusting the calculation of a patient's copay accumulator, specifically how far along they are to meeting that cost-sharing obligation. Where it becomes relevant with manufacturer coupons and copay offers is that plans do not count the proceeds of these offers toward the patient's progress in satisfying their cost-sharing obligation. Where this becomes particularly problematic for patients is that at some point throughout the year, a number of them, due to this, will reach what we like to call, and throughout the industry you probably hear, as the copay surprise. Essentially, the patient exhausts the benefits of the copay offer, but they haven't made any progress toward, or very little progress toward meeting their deductible. And so on their next fill, they're faced with a fairly significant out-of-pocket expense. And at some point throughout the year, that's something that they encounter and obviously causes a significant barrier to access for the patient. Copay maximizer design are the same essential concept, but rather than forcing that copay surprise on a patient, the value of the manufacturer copay offer is essentially spread out more evenly throughout the year. In some maximizer benefit designs, the plan will bill 1/12 of the maximum annual value of the manufacturer copay offer each month. So the advantage of this, at least from a patient standpoint, is that the patients aren't faced with that point in the year where they've exhausted the benefit and then they're faced with the out-of-pocket costs. But the key thing to remember on both of these, obviously, is that they shift costs away from a plan to the manufacturer and/or patients. It's simply a way that health plans are capitalizing on the availability of manufacturer copay offers in an attempt to shift away some of those costs. So with that said, we'll get into our first polling question. What we want to do is just kind of take a look at what your current situation is regarding accumulators and maximizers. Generally, when we speak about this topic, we see individuals and organizations come at it from a number of starting points. So if you take a look, choose the option that best describes your scenario, whether you're just starting to learn about the issue or you're very much aware of it and you're kind of in the thick of looking at how you're going to deal with it. Take a few moments, consider that, and go ahead and enter your responses. And then, Sean, when we're ready, we can move forward and look at some results.
Okay, coming in first, 41%, aware of the issue and actively monitoring impact. Coming in second, need to learn more about the issue. That's at 35%. Coming in third at 16%, understand the issue but unsure if my program is impacted. And last but not least at 9%, impacted and planning to or have taken actions to address. Okay, excellent. And that is not surprising. That actually lines up fairly well with what we see when we engage with the market on this topic. Aware of the issue, actively monitoring impact, that is a strategy that a number of pharmaceutical manufacturers have taken in the last year and a half with regard to this issue. Recently, and as I said, these poll results actually are not surprising at all. We have gotten a lot of inquiries as well recently around need to learn more about the issue. And I think that kind of speaks to one of the trends that we're seeing is an increased prevalence to the point where a lot of individuals that previously may have been aware of it but not dealt with it that much or at all are now of the mind that they need to get some knowledge about it, need to get some information, start factoring into their plans. So good results, and again, hopefully this session today will help you in that regard. So moving on, we want to take a look at trends in 2020. So this is something where our organization, across our portfolio of copay programs, we broke it down by specific therapeutic areas. We took a look at two things, really, the percentage of patients in a number of specialty drug copay programs that were experiencing accumulator impact, and then also what the corresponding reimbursement spend from those programs was on impacted patients. And the best way to view this chart, I did try to put some call-outs there to help with the explanations, but essentially the columns are the patients when you're looking at 2019 year-to-date to 2020 year-to-date. So basically this same point a year ago through the first portion of 2019 compared to what we're seeing right now in 2020. The lines, again, represent reimbursement, and it's a bit, I don't want to say misleading, but it's hard to get all this information into one visual. Obviously, there's not a direct advancement in reimbursement percentages from one therapeutic class to the other, as the line may appear. What you're really ultimately looking at is within each therapeutic class, the distance, the difference between the blue line and the green shows the increase. So
The main takeaway from this is that we have seen impact pretty much across the board, both in overall impacted patients and then also very specifically in individual therapeutic classes, patients that have been impacted this year over last, and also, a corresponding increase in how much of the reimbursement budget for a program that those patients are consuming. So not at all surprising there. Again, I think it speaks to this is what's driving a lot more people to feel a need to become aware of this issue and start to understand this issue a little more. So it has, and that's in line with what we've seen. If you look back even further, from 2018 to 2019, we also saw a few percent increase in overall impacted patients year to year. So the main takeaway in terms of impact is that it is slowly increasing as time goes on. Another trend that we also wanted to highlight through the first several months of 2020 is the shift to more copay maximizer designs. And this is something that in the first few months, the data sort of proved it out that within the first few months of the year, around March, April timeframe. What we actually saw in a number of programs was that the amount of reimbursement spend per impacted patient was actually less this year than it was at the same point in 2019. And while at face value, that may seem like a good thing, when we watched it month to month as it progressed, in actuality, what it seemed to indicate was that shift to the maximizer design. Instead of seeing a lot of financial impact earlier in the year, it was being more evenly distributed throughout the year. So the takeaway from that is, as we reach the point in the year where we are now, basically the midway point and heading into the second half of the year, that will eventually start to balance itself out to where more and more patients max out the copay for leaving manufacturers' budget impacted to that more significant degree. But that was another interesting observation as we saw, and I kind of characterize the shift to maximizers as basically from the plan standpoint, a little bit more patient-friendly option because again, they're not leaving patients with that surprise at some point in the year. As we look now at the 2021 Notice of Benefit and Payment Parameters, so this was released. This is the rule released by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services that outlines the parameters within which health plan sponsors can operate copay accumulators and maximizers. So the rule for 2021 was released in the first week of May. Actually, the draft rule came out at the very end of January, and there was a public comment period where CMS took feedback into consideration before publishing the final rule. But basically, to summarize it in broad, plain language, it gives plan sponsors a significant degree of flexibility. In fact, CMS actually uses that terminology a number of times throughout the flexibility with which they can choose how to incorporate these into their benefit design. So it is permissive, which is the term that gets used in a lot of analysis. It says, plan sponsors, they can count manufacturer copay offers towards a patient's cost-sharing responsibility, but they are not required to. So this, again, it speaks to the desire for CMS to basically allow plans to make the decision as to when and how they incorporate these. CMS, to get into some of the background on it, and they offer kind of some commentary on this in the text of the rule. They view accumulator adjustments as a way that plan sponsors can kind of address some of the high cost of branded medication. Now, obviously, there's an argument on the manufacturer side and the patient side of that to the contrary. But as far as from a rulemaking standpoint, that's kind of the angle that CMS is approaching it from. They want to give plans the flexibility to determine how they incorporate this. One of the points that it clarifies this year, when I say it gives a lot broader flexibility, last year in 2019, as the rule was being drafted and issued to cover 2020, there was a fair amount of confusion and uncertainty to the extent that CMS actually issued a follow-up clarification around August of last year, as there was a lot of uncertainty around how the rule would be interpreted. it specifies that plans can operate these regardless of whether a drug has an available generic or not. You know, in some cases, there was some talk about, with regard to last year's rule, if a drug did not have a medically appropriate generic available, then it became all the more important for a patient to be able to use copay assistance and also receive that credit towards their deductible. So this year, kind of CMS removed a lot of any of the uncertainty around that, and basically, again, said plans are sort of free to operate these as they see fit, and generic availability does not come into question, is not part of the equation whatsoever. The final key point to highlight with regard to the 2021 notice is that any state laws that prohibit the practice of accumulator adjustments and maximizers do take precedence. In fact, the way it's worded within the document, it says to the extent in which it's consistent with applicable state laws. However, a key point to always mention, and that I always make sure that we mention when we speak about this, is that any state regulation regulations do not apply to self-funded plans. So any fully insured plans that are governed by a state insurance commission, that state law would take precedence over this. And we'll get a little bit more into state laws here in a little bit. But on the fully insured side, or excuse me, on the self-funded side, those state laws would not apply. So as I mentioned, a little bit more on state legislation. So as of now, to date, there are 4 states that currently have laws on the books that prohibit health plans from operating accumulator adjustments. You see the states there. I have a few news clippings out there to the right. I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar today have been following this fairly closely. A number of other states have similar legislation that's been proposed, and it just hasn't made its way, hasn't come to fruition yet. So whether it's stalled out at some point of the legislative process or it's still in process and pending, no other states have adopted any type of law that would outlaw this practice. And again, as I mentioned there, under the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which also governs self-funded employer health plans, these laws would not prevent self-funded plans from operating accumulators or maximizers. And that's important to mention because self-funded plans do make up approximately 60% of the employer market. That's according to last year's Kaiser Family Foundation survey. I believe it's actually 61%. So the key takeaway from that is just simply to remember that even if a number of other states were to follow suit with these 4, that would be helpful in terms of mitigating the impact of accumulators and maximizers. But state legislation is by no means the answer to this. It's not an issue that would just simply be legislated away if states were to pass laws against it. That leads us up to our next polling question. Interested in hearing where everyone obtains most of their information about developments and trends on accumulators and maximizers. So the types of things that we just discussed, market trends, kind of how these are progressing, and are we seeing increases or decreases, what therapeutic classes are being impacted, the development of regulations and laws, just any type of information to keep you abreast of this and keep you up on current developments.
Okay.
Right.
Coming in first at 53%, self-research, conferences, and webinars. Coming in second at 22%, internal teams, brand leadership, legal counsel, etc. Coming in third at 13%, external consultants and or counsel. And last but not least, at 11%, copay program provider.
Okay, actually, very interesting. Interesting results there. Not entirely surprising that self-research is a big area into this topic, simply due to the fact that there are so many complexities and angles around this. I think it's difficult within any type of organization, whether it's from our perspective, from the copay program provider side. This is a recent development where we have put the ownership of this issue into one specific area, into the role that I've that I've filled in our product development team, kind of staying on top of this and researching, and speaking with our clients and educating the issue. But it is difficult to sort of assign ownership to a topic like this. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of self-research within the spread of things. I would say on the copay program provider side, this is an area where the copay program providers are fairly well suited to be able to provide this type of information, just due to the nature of managing your copay program, kind of having the data and being able to track the trends and analyze claim patterns and be able to really see and dig in to see what's going on. So it's a combination of the data analysis, and then also keeping pace with the regulatory landscape and all the legislative developments, market news surrounding it. All right, next area we want to get into a little bit. What are variable copay programs? So undoubtedly, this is a sort of a subset of the broader accumulator conversation that I think does tend to throw a lot of people for a curveball, again, just because it's adding a layer of complexity. And what you tend to see with these are that they are a type of copay maximizer offering where patients will get offered, it's actually presented as a very good deal for patients. They'll get offered a low, or in many cases, a $0 cost obligation for a number of covered specialty drugs. These types of programs are generally seen with self-funded plans, because self-funding obviously gives the plan sponsor the flexibility with their benefit design to essentially change their benefit design as they see fit. So ultimately, what the plan will do is, upon discovering the availability of a manufacturer copay offer, they will deem that drug non-essential, and then costs for, under the ACA, under the Affordable Care Act, costs for non-essential services are not required to be counted towards a patient's cost-sharing obligation. So prescription drugs, as a broad category, are deemed essential by the ACA, but within that, plans have the flexibility to determine as a specific drug classified as non-essential. And oftentimes a practice that we see is, especially in a class where there may be multiple different options, and one has an available copay offer and significant market share, plan may deem that the non-essential drug and then cover as the essential drug the one with smaller market share as a way to enable them to operate this type of benefit design. So basically, a non-essential drug, and then the plan will set the monthly copay for the drug either to be exact or fairly closely approximate the manufacturer's copay offer. So again, that's where it incorporates the maximizer design. Each month, essentially, the patient, when they have their claim and fill their prescription, the bulk of the majority of the cost will be shifted to the manufacturer offer, so that the plan pays little, patient in many cases pays none, and the manufacturer offer is maxed out. These are often seen administered through third-party providers, and in some cases it'll be in tandem with PBMs. They'll have relationships where, and they're called various things throughout the industry. A lot of them, they have a lot of similarities: copay optimization programs, copay protection programs. But that's often the model that you see, where it's a PBM aligning with a third-party organization that operates this and does the interface with patients. Kind of their model then, from the plan, for the plan sponsor, their value proposition to the plan sponsor is obviously the savings that they can get for the plan sponsor on their costs, and a portion of that is what becomes the fee, the management fee for operating the program. So that's where, when you hear a little bit about these programs and you hear them talked about, just kind of some really brief background on what they are and how they fit into the conversation. Because I think from what we've seen, that's generally an area that can cause some confusion discussing the issue. So what to watch for in 2021? This is the time of year where a lot of brands, you're either beginning brand planning, or if you haven't, it's going to start fairly soon for the coming year. So I think, hopefully some timely thoughts to work into what you as you go through that exercise and kind of think about your copay program for the coming year. And the first one, it's actually one that, is sort of a curveball that got thrown at everyone earlier this year, but it's very much going to have an impact on a number of things going forward, and accumulators and maximizers are no exception, is of course the economic conditions that are resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, with a number of businesses looking for cost savings, these accumulator maximizer programs and benefit designs could present that option and become even more attractive to plans that may have been considering them in the past and haven't taken action, or plans that may not have even had that consideration, but again, are looking for kind of some areas for cost savings as a result of the conditions we find ourselves in. There was actually a recent article, I think it came out in April of this year. It was a Kaiser Health News article, and it cited a study by the Business Group on Health that I believe the statistic it had in there was that an additional 15% of employers were considering incorporating accumulators in their benefit designs over the next 2 years. And based on the timing, I'm inclined to believe, I don't know for certain, so I will say that, but I'm inclined to believe that research may very well have been even conducted pre-COVID. So, if that's the case, then I would think that the COVID economic conditions would only seek to increase that. So certainly something to keep an eye on as we head into next year. Also, we definitely, in the second bullet there, we expect a continued shift to more of the maximizer utilization. Again, I think it's a way that can help achieve that cost savings on the plan sponsor side, but in a way that is less detrimental to patients, I think. It kind of almost can be presented as a good deal to patients. And so I think you'll see more and more plans taking advantage, trying to leverage that option versus just a traditional accumulator adjustment. The third one is a question that we get a fair amount, and it's around how are there accumulator implications for medical benefit copay programs, so drugs that are covered under the medical benefit. And to really talk about that, we kind of have to back up a little bit, and without, as I said earlier, going completely back into accumulators 101, talk about on the pharmacy benefit side, it's a lot, the mechanisms to operate accumulator adjustments exist much easier. All pharmacy copay claims are adjudicated by NCP processing standards. There's an electronic claim transaction, and it's that data that ultimately enables the operation of accumulator adjustments. So every claim that happens, there's coding that references a payment type. So whether it's commercial insurance or in the case of a manufacturer program, in a coordination of benefits scenario as a secondary payer, that copay card would be coded as a manufacturer coupon. And then that is the data that's simply rolled up and analyzed, and that the PBM would use to adjust the patient's, conduct accumulator maintenance appropriately for the patient. But when you go over to the medical benefit side, and there's a lot more manual claim processing, submission of EOBs, and things like that, it gets much more difficult to do something like that, and there's not as simple of a mechanism like that. So there has been some discussion in recent years. It hasn't really come to fruition much, if at all. It's something that I think is absolutely worth continuing to monitor and keep an eye on and follow. Some discussion around plans putting provisions in place around requiring patients to disclose use of copay cards. And basically, under the threat of potential termination from the plan if they were to, if that were to get discovered that a patient was using a copay offer and did not disclose that. It's something that, again, we haven't seen a whole lot of to date, but it is being talked about for the purpose of also being able to carry out these types of strategies on drugs that are covered under the medical benefit. And then kind of going along that line, when you get to the bottom bullet here, another strategy that we have seen, and quite honestly, I think this is what you may see more of as we head into the coming year, is plans shifting some maintenance drugs that are covered under the medical benefit over to the pharmacy benefit for the purpose of doing actually that, being able to operate accumulator adjustments and have the claim data to do so. So basically what that would entail is essentially white bag dispensing to the site of care, and that way it's able to be tracked through a standard copay claim and be done on a systematic level through data reporting. So again, something to keep an eye on as we head into the coming year, because again, I think the overarching theme to all this is that a number of plans are going to look for more opportunities to incorporate strategies like this. So this topic, we do want to spend some time on a very, very recent topic as of a few days ago. And the CMS's proposed revisions to best price determination, because there are copay accumulator implications to this. And then when I say recent, this is truly very recent. It came out last Thursday, so just a few days ago. But essentially, what it entails is CMS directly references, and I pulled a few snippets from the document there on the left-hand side. CMS directly references copay accumulator adjustment programs in terms of talking about manufacturer copay offers and how the benefit amount is applied, and ultimately who it goes to the benefit of. So the proposal that CMS has put forth, and also interesting about this is that they did it with a 30-day public comment period, as opposed to in a lot of cases that period is long. And I reference back to the draft notice, 2021 notice of benefit and payment parameters. It was a multiple month comment period. So a short timeline on this. But what CMS has proposed is that copay programs that currently have exclusion from best price computation. So the value of the copay program is not counted in when a manufacturer is reporting best price. CMS has proposed that exclusion only be kept in cases where if the manufacturer ensures that the benefit of the copay program copay offer goes exclusively to the patient, not to any other party, for example, the health plan. So that bottom bullet there, basically puts the onus, which is interesting, puts an onus on the manufacturer to ensure that the benefit of their copay programs are applied only to the patient, not to other interests. So this absolutely kind of threw a curveball to a number of people throughout the industry, and I think right now everyone is kind of actively analyzing it, researching it, trying to really make sense of what all it could involve and what the implications could be. So certainly something that we plan to keep an eye on and take a more detailed look at. But it could have fairly significant implications for copay programs as we head into the coming year. So final polling question. Curious as to the biggest challenge that your organization has faced involving accumulators and maximizers. And recognizing that, depending on where you sit as far as whether you're on the manufacturer side or you're a consultant advising manufacturers, or we have attendees from other areas of the industry, this may be slightly different. Obviously, we've approached this questions from the standpoint of a copay program provider, helping support manufacturers in operating these programs. But just give some consideration as to what are the biggest hurdles that you have faced in your organization. Make your choice as to which, if any of these, have a direct impact to you. All right, interesting. So 40% lack of detailed data to drive informed decisions. Again, I think that slightly surprising. It does, however, speak to, as we were talking earlier, about just the ability to really have kind of assigned ownership within an organization to this topic, and put the systems in place and put the mechanisms in place to gather the information, both market research as well as data analysis. Coming in second with 24%, inability to quantify results or the impact of addressing. That's actually not surprising. Something that we hear a fair amount of talk to manufacturers, saying we did certain things to try to mitigate the impact of these, and we don't know how well they're working. We've had that direct comment made to us a number of times from manufacturers that we initially engage with. So that's actually not surprising at all. We'll get into a little bit later in the presentation, get into some ways kind of to help look at that and help directly address it. Coming in third, difficulty understanding regulatory provisions that govern. I think that kind of speaks for itself. It is a very complicated issue. Continually changes and has new rules and regulations around it. And last, at 14%, was internal limitations on ability to address. And so that's, there are certain subset, specifically on the manufacturer side, where their organizational position has simply been that it's an issue that they understand is there, and it's simply not something that they are going to take action on at this time. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, but not surprising also. All right, so getting into keys to an effective mitigation strategy. The first bullet there, and I can't stress this enough, is the ongoing monitoring to assess the impact. I think this is one of those problems that everyone knows it exists, but to really understand it, you have to exactly quantify and describe how it exists and how it impacts not just your organization, but your programs in particular. You have responsibility for multiple brands, or if you have responsibility for multiple different copay offers within a brand or something like that. Really understanding, both from a data standpoint, being able to, and a lot of this again is done through your copay program provider. Being able to analyze the claim data, have the algorithms in place that can assess impact, understand what percentage of your patients are impacted, understand what that corresponds to in reimbursement spend. Because really, at the end of the day, just like any other business problem, this is a cost-benefit decision. So it'll reach, at some point, it will reach a tipping point to where it can no longer be something for your organization that you simply chalk up to, say, as the saying goes, the cost of doing business. But you need to have good, insightful, and detailed data to be able to understand where that point is, because obviously it's different for every brand, different for every program. Second bullet there, this is fairly important as well. Clear and detailed patient education to explain the issue and guide them through whatever options may exist on this. The best way I describe this whenever I speak, especially to manufacturers on it, is to put myself in the shoes of a patient and think of myself if I were not working in this business. So obviously, in a broad sense, we're all consumers of healthcare in our personal lives, and I think were it not for working in this industry, I would be hard pressed to understand how a lot of this works. See how complicated it is to understand for those of us that do work in business. So I think building into your strategy very clear and very detailed, kind of almost talking points, messaging points to patients around what exactly this is, what's happening with your insurance, why is it happening, where does this lead them, can you still use your copay offer, how do you access benefits, what do you need to do. You really need to have a very detailed and thought out plan as to how you guide your patients through this issue, because that's where, in the absence of that, you can lose a lot of patients. Simply, people I think have a general sense that healthcare is complicated, and the inability to fully understand what's going on is something that can often be to your detriment in terms of getting continued participation in the program. So definitely want to highlight the importance of that. And then finally, that last bullet, I think the polling results on one of the previous questions really spoke to that. Having an effective performance reporting capability in place. So if you do take any actions, make adjustments to your program in terms of your business rules or operational adjustments as far as how it works, how patients access the offer, things like that, being able to demonstrate the impact of this, specifically demonstrate the impact on the success of getting patients to be able to continue participating in the program. I think, again, it's something that you can't approach this issue in generalities. You have to truly be able to quantify results, quantify impact, and quantify results. So that's a very important consideration as you're working through your far as how to address this. On the topic of impact monitoring, we want to take a look at, these are examples of reports that our organization does for our copay program clients. And we started out when this issue was first kind of gaining some steam around 2017, 18. This was something that we would do on an ad hoc basis when a client asked us for us and through a request through our analytics team. But as the issues become more prevalent, it made sense to where we integrated this type of reporting into our standard reporting suite for the copay programs we manage. So the benefit of that is that there's not a delay in having access that information, request it, and access it. A program manager that meets daily with their client or talks multiple times a week to their client on the pharma side can actively monitor this and be able to tell them, oh, we're seeing your percentage of accumulator patients is starting to creep up. Should we take a look at your business rules, or is there something we could potentially do? And also, looking at your trends year over year, because this is where, as I mentioned earlier, you can gain those insights around, specifically things like increased use of maximizers. Is my percentage of patients impacted is outpacing, the growth of that is outpacing the percentage of reimbursement spend that's being consumed by those patients. So definitely valuable to have a detailed monitoring and reporting through the claim data that comes in through the program, because that's really the foundation of determining how you address this issue. So the example I point out, I'm sure a lot of people have been able to just kind of read it and digest it as I was talking here, but this is a program where you're seeing fairly significant copay accumulator effect. You have 12% of your patients so far in 2020 are consuming over half of your program reimbursement budget. So again, coming back to that idea of cost-benefit analysis, that line is different for every brand, but being able to have those insights to make those decisions as far as if you need to address this in a different way, I think that's extremely powerful. And as far as additional best practices, we talked a lot about monitoring and mitigating impact, which is critically important. And you should have a well thought out plan for that. But I would also offer as a best practice to truly examine the full story and work in parallel on the advocacy and education front, because basically addressing, it's kind of that analogy that you hear a lot, addressing symptoms versus addressing root cause. And so when you work, and I look on the manufacturer side specifically, and I've had some conversations with individuals in organizations that are part of employer teams and work with plan sponsors and employer groups and try to influence benefit design. And a lot of that is around coverage for products, but I think this topic is going to become, or definitely should become, part of the conversation. Because from a plan sponsor standpoint, and especially on the employer side, you're looking at organizations that they only see the first level cost savings. To them, this looks like a great idea, sort of no reason not to incorporate these. But I would say really try to have that conversation about looking at the long-term consequences of these. Specifically, when you look at an accumulator scenario, for example, a patient that reaches that copay surprise and eventually, is faced with significant financial burden to accessing therapy, they are going to do a couple of different things. They're either going to discontinue therapy, which in a number of cases could result in higher overall healthcare costs in the long run. So for the employer, it could negate any savings that they may have realized, or they're simply going to become a less productive employee. They're going to be distracted. They're going to be stressed. They're going to have financial issues on their mind. How am I going to absorb this cost, and how will I deal with this? And I had someone tell me one time that you don't want your employees coming to work spending time during the workday on their phone or out in the lobby trying to make calls to figure out how they're going to sort out the insurance issues and things like that. You want them at work and focused and able to be productive and do what you need them there for. So really kind of having that conversation to look past just the short-term cost savings, because there are more sides to the story. And I've cited, if you look at these slides, and if you go back and view the replay, and you can access this study online, there's actually a very good study published last year in the American Journal of Managed Care that looked at exactly that, the long-term adherence to specialty drugs for patients that were affected by an accumulator adjustment program and not affected. It was done by Dr. Bruce Sherman, who I've actually got to know and have a few conversations around this issue with. And there's some very, very insightful information around that. So I would certainly offer to make that part of the conversation, especially, again, speaking and working with plan sponsors. So that's all the prepared material we have. We do have a little bit of time left, so certainly happy to entertain any questions. I hope this was informative for everyone. Obviously a number of things to discuss, and again, happy to take any questions in a few minutes we have left.
Great, bunch of questions coming in, Jason. First one, what are the potential implications of the recent CMS best price revision proposal you discussed earlier in the presentation, not just in terms of accumulators, but for copay programs overall?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very timely and very very relevant question, I think, for all of us. And honestly, the answer is, at this point, we just don't know. It's literally a few days old. I think there are a number of things that could materialize out of it if the rule were to be implemented as proposed. But I think it would be definitely short-sighted at this point to try to say here's what's likely to happen. So I think really the best course of action in terms of addressing it is that it's certainly something that needs to be monitored and kept abreast of developments. Our organization has formed a task force to sort of learn more about it and really start to understand it. That consists of both our internal experts as well as we've engaged external consultants and counsel, people with knowledge of the industry. So I think, again, assigning ownership, really digging in and learning the details is one thing. And then specifically on the pharma side, I would say that this is an opportunity to really raise a voice and participate in that comment process, because this could have significant and wide-ranging impacts for copay programs. So if I could offer anything to the pharma side, it's to be vocal and to raise the issues that this would present. Specifically around curtailing patients' ability to access therapy. Because the reality of it is that this could cause some specialty drug copay programs just to simply become untenable if it were implemented as proposed, and patients need copay assistance to access a number of therapies, especially in cases where there may not be any alternative. So for the pharma attendees in the audience, I would certainly recommend that as a course of action. Getting involved in that education, advocacy, participating in the comment period, and trying to kind of raise a voice around the negative implications.
Okay. And can you better explain what's meant by under best price determination, placing the accountability / onus on the manufacturer to ensure the benefit is directly to the patient?
Yes. So there is a portion of language in the document, basically where it references, and I'm trying to think, I can't remember it verbatim, but it essentially says we, and we being CMS, we understand manufacturers can incorporate into their offering ways to determine that it's only used to the benefit of the patient. So when they conclude with the recommendation, with their proposal, they basically say that the manufacturer, the way they word it, the manufacturer would have to be able to demonstrate that the benefit of the copay offer goes only to patients and is not captured by health plans in some of the accumulator and maximizer scenarios. If you look at, and I'm speaking from memory, it begins, page 46 of the proposed rule is where the section begins, and when you go down to the very ending of that section, where it speaks about proposed revisions to best price calculation. I'm fairly certain it's the last paragraph, and they talk about it. But basically, the way they word it is that the onus will be on the manufacturer to demonstrate that the proceeds of the offer are applied to the benefit of the patient.
And nationally across the board, do you have any sense for what percentage of plans or PBMs have or are implementing accumulators and maximizers?
So percentage of plans, I can't speak directly to. From our standpoint in operating copay programs, we generally look at it as percentage of patients' impact. So I can say over the last few years, we've seen that go from around 5% in 2018 to a little over 7% last year in 19. And based on what we've seen year to date in 2020, it's projected to reach around 8.5% this year. So that's primarily the angle that we look at it from. Some of the good resources out there to look at percentage of plans that incorporate it. I mentioned earlier, there's a Kaiser Health News article that came out recently in April, and it cites some survey data around, I believe they mentioned 34% of employer plan sponsors currently used accumulators and maximizers within the last year. But again, that's something that I can't speak directly to. It's not an area that we do direct research in, but there are some resources out there to give a little bit of insight into that.
Okay. And as best you can answer this, Jason, are you aware of any protected classes when it comes to copay accumulators or maximizers, like oncology products, for example?
I am not. Yeah, I can't. We've seen it impact a wide array of therapeutic classes. We've seen it across a number of different programs. So to my knowledge, I don't. No, I'm not aware of any that are by any sort of provision or regulation protected. You know, there are elements of decision making on the plan side when determining benefit design. You know, they're aware of what the potential implications for a patient may be, and they simply, even if it could provide cost savings, they may not want to do this for certain therapeutic areas, just knowing the nature of the disease state and the fact that this could very well be a life-saving medication. Having an accumulator adjustment in place may make a person unable to afford. So that there could be elements of decision making and benefit. But now I'm not aware of any specifically protected classes where these can't be operated.
Okay. And is there any shift going on from specialty to traditional drugs that you're aware of?
Not a lot. This is by nature a specialty drug problem. And the reason for that is just simply due to cost. Generally, any impact on like a lower cost retail product, it's minimal, if any. This is primarily confined to specialty drugs.
Okay, and we have a question about HHS. Now, knowing that you can't really look into the crystal ball and predict the future, in your best estimate, do you expect HHS to revisit this rule in 2021? It seems as though in the direction 2019 was to mandate these funds accumulate, but maybe that changed in 2020.
Yeah, that's, I think, for all of us within the industry, that is sort of where we are at right now. We don't have a crystal ball, and you can make a best guess, and then, as I said, kind of a new wrinkle will get added, as we saw recently last week. So I would, if I had to make an educated guess, I would say absolutely there will be some level of revisiting that happens, and I think that's, last year they being CMS, directly addressed it that way when they issued the August update FAQ. They said we'll revisit this when we enter into rulemaking for 2021. So I think there could be some revisiting. Now, how much that ultimately changes the direction and their stance on this, I don't know. One of the things that really stood out to me when I read this year's notice of benefit and payment parameters was that CMS was being very clear and very intentional in taking the position that they see copay card, they see accumulators as a way for, and they directly say this in the text of the document, they see accumulator adjustments as a way that plans can offset some of the costs associated with high cost drugs. So I can't really speculate as to whether if there would be any sort of a change in position, but I think it's something that will continue to get revisited, just simply for the fact that it has wide-ranging implications throughout the industry. So ultimately, there's going to be a lot of discussion, commenting, lobbying both sides. So I think continue to get revisited here.
Okay. And Jason, could you speak to the role a patient support hub might play in addressing copay accumulators and maximizers?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's actually a good question because a hub can have a very key role in that element of patient outreach that I mentioned earlier. Again, it goes back to the idea that this is a complicated topic. And then again, when you're dealing with a lot of specialty medications, it's a complicated situation for the patient. Health concerns, you have the financial aspect of it. In a lot of cases, there's other elements of coordination of care, and just it's a stressful situation. So to be thrown into a scenario where you don't understand why your drug may not be covered the way you thought it was, or why you're not getting the benefit of what you thought you would have as an assistance offer, the value of having someone to guide and educate through that scenario is critical. So, a number of copay program providers in the industry. Obviously, we know that there's several that do both copay and hub services. So if you have your copay program and your hub under one roof, that obviously kind of streamlines a lot of that and makes it easier. But if you don't, and I can say, our organization, we operate in both capacities where we have both sides, and where we also have to interface with other hub providers. So, making certain, if you're in the latter of those scenarios, making certain that there is a good communication and good coordination between the copay provider and your hub provider to really be able to identify patients and then determine the messaging and the education to go out to those patients and help kind of walk them through, guide them through this issue. Eliminate as much of the stress as you can around it for them.
Okay. And another question, other than to discourage the use of branded products, what's the reason for plans to implement accumulator adjustments when it clearly affects the patient's access to needed medications, especially when there's no generic equivalent?
Yeah, I think really it would ultimately go back to that cost savings. I think just understanding it, if you understand it in only that, I guess I don't want to necessarily use the term one-dimensional, but if you only look at it from that standpoint, it kind of just seems like a way to shift costs. There's a manufacturer copay offer, and by incorporating this type of benefit design, we're able to have that absorb the majority of the cost for the drug. So ultimately, I think on the plan side, that's really what it is, because as we know within the industry, it's just an ongoing kind of tug of war over which who should absorb and be responsible for the majority of costs around a lot of medications. So, I think from the employer side, especially when you're dealing with a self-funded plan where you're paying the claims, I think it comes down to a cost savings issue. But again, that as I mentioned earlier, that just highlights also the need to take into consideration. While that's absolutely relevant, also take into consideration what are the other consequences of that, not just only focus in on that upfront cost savings.
Okay. And again, with time for one last question, acknowledging that you can't predict the future or that you have a crystal ball, in your estimate of just what you've seen, do you have any sense for the likelihood that assistance programs will be more limited or restricted in 2021 or 2022?
I can't. It's something that, I think the crystal ball reference is appropriate because we can't really say with any type of certainty at this point. I do think, again, to echo my comments around, on the pharma side, being very vocal and very active in addressing this proposed revision to best price computation, I think that is absolutely critical. Because reality is, if implemented as proposed, then yes, there could be significant impacts to copay programs. Now, where kind of the ability to really predict goes away is you don't know, how that would be carried out in practice, which, that's a theme that's fairly common throughout this entire issue of accumulators is here's what could be done, here's what, is able to happen, but what would actually happen. So that's the area that I don't think at this point any of us can really say, but I do think, there certainly is a potential. So it's something that has to be, kept abreast of and addressed appropriately.
Okay. And that does it. We are about out of time. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to our presenter. I want to take a moment to thank our presenter, Jason, for delivering a fantastic session. Want to thank TrialCard for making today's webinar possible. Just a reminder that the webinar has been recorded. You'll receive a link to the video so you can view it again. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Hope you all have a great day, and this now concludes today's webinar.